Good evening, and welcome everyone to the Network for Responsible Public Policy's first program of the fall season. I'm Jenny Smith-Wilson, a trustee of NFRPP. We're so happy that you've joined us tonight. The Network for Responsible Public Policy connects people with thought leaders who educate and inspire. Tonight will not disappoint. Tonight, we're going to dive into the state of the 2024 elections and with context and predictions from Academe. We're so fortunate to have Susan Herbst and Jeff Manza here tonight. Susan is a professor of political science and the president emeritus of the University of Connecticut. Jeff is a professor of sociology and the chair of the Department of Sociology at New York University. For more information on our distinguished speakers, please visit our website, where you'll find their bios along with our extensive libraries of videos of past programs and a wealth of information on relevant topics. No doubt this conversation will generate questions. Please type those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Susan and Jeff, thank you both for being here. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thanks so much, Jenny. It's our pleasure, and we're glad to talk about these incredibly important issues tonight. The format will be, I'll be asking Jeff, Professor Manza, I'll be asking him questions, and then we'll discuss them. Then at about 8 o'clock, we'll open it up for questions, and Jenny will moderate those. So why don't we start with the kind of the biggest problem, conundrum in American politics right now, which is our political polarization. And we see it all around us. Everybody on this webinar knows that we're extremely polarized and that we've not seen anything like it in a very long time, maybe since those years, the 1850s, before the Civil War, where there was extreme polarization. And there are some very good books on this and some popular books I like a lot, like Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized, I think is still an incredibly readable, good laying out of the issues. But I wanted to ask Jeff what social scientists make of this polarization, the extent of it and the reasons behind it, because just like the American public's interested in this, social scientists have been extraordinarily focused on it.
Yeah, thank you, Susan, and thank you for inviting me to this. I would say that in the study of American politics, the debate over polarization has probably been the single most heated topic over the last 10 years or so. Of course, the historical roots of rising polarization really trace back to the disappearance of the Southern Democrats and the liberal Republicans, often in the Northeast. Those two kinds of politicians have largely disappeared. There was once a time when there were several Democrats in the Senate who would be to the right, Senate Democrats who would be to the right of the most liberal Republicans and vice versa. So it was possible to craft bipartisan legislation where you make compromises with this kind of middle group. But over the last 25 years or so, there hasn't been a single Democrat in the Senate or the House who is more liberal or conservative than the most liberal or conservative member of the other party. So that center group has largely disappeared. And then paralleling that was evidence that the Republican Party was undergoing a shift that really begins in the late 70s, in which the party became increasingly conservative. And I remember circa 2010 having conversations and reading some of the literature on polarization that was primarily focused on elite polarization, that is members of Congress, the media, but not so much the mass, not so much ordinary people. And for a long time, it was thought that really polarization is an elite phenomenon. Most of us on the ground still can talk to one another across the political divide and so forth. But increasingly, that has begun to shift in the research on polarization, so that we're now seeing growing evidence that ordinary people, citizens, voters, are also becoming more hostile to members of the other party, their political identity, their party identity has become more important to many people. And there's even evidence that once you've adopted a partisan identity, you often shift your attitudes to align with your political party. So if you just look at Americans' attitudes across a wide range of policy, political issues, there hasn't been a lot of shifting overall. But what has happened is that Republicans and Democrats have more reliably sorted themselves, so that you can, on most issues, you don't have nearly as many people choosing the wrong option given their political party identification. So at this point, I think it's fair to say that the state of the debate is that among political elites, party elites in Congress and in the media, we've known for a long time that polarization has grown, and as Susan said, really is as high in recent years as it's been at any point since the middle of the 19th century, as best we can tell from studies of congressional voting patterns, where you can analyze every single vote every member of Congress has made. But now I think we're also beginning to see ordinary people beginning to polarize. And so now we have a bunch of new studies, Democrats like to sip lattes and Republicans, don't like those fancy coffee drinks. Parents would not like their child to bring home a strong liberal or conservative, depending on their political preferences. Studies of dating sites have found that when the site has a political affiliation, that people will not choose somebody they might reach out to somebody they might otherwise reach out to if they're a member of the other party or express strong liberal or conservative views. So these are all signs that something pretty dramatic has happened, that isn't not just an elite phenomenon, not just something going on in Congress and in the media, but really across the entire population.
So this is vital, I think, to understanding is that 25 years ago, media were starting to become polarized. There were, there's a cable news, there's Fox, there's MSNBC, and Congress was getting increasingly polarized. And then more recently, people are taking those, regular citizens becoming polarized. How do you think that happens mechanically? Like, how is it that those elites, media elites, Congress are polarizing? How did it infect us? Why did you do this to us?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of ways of thinking about this in a kind of a long-term historical perspective. Levels of education are steadily growing as older people die off and better educated young people enter voting age and older, and better educated people are better equipped to connect their own views and their party identification with their kind of general orientation to the world. So I think that's one big long-term factor. I mean, that's been happening over many decades. Today about 40% of young people under 34 will have a BA. So, it's not a majority of the population, but probably 2/3 will have spent some time in college, whereas older cohorts, people over 65, 75, far fewer went to college and had that experience. So that's first thing to say, at least made the conditions for this polarization to kind of reemerge at the mass level. Second thing I think is quite important is that it's taken a while for the elite polarization to really begin to register among all voters. So the National Election Study, one of the main sources of historical data, it's been fielded every year since 1952. If you go up until the early 80s, you don't see people not expressing a lot of sense there's big differences between the Democrats and Republicans. So those most well-informed voters were well aware, but a lot of people thought, it's not that much difference between the Democrats and Republicans. Certainly there was a time among academics, younger academics in particular, where those who were kind of left-leaning or liberal-leaning would be, quite angry that the Democratic Party wasn't more progressive than the Republican Party. I remember those kinds of debates when I was in graduate school and so forth. But increasingly, as the elites have polarized, people are beginning, slowly becoming more aware of the degree to which the parties really stand for very different policy and political positions. And at the same time, they are not only becoming aware of those differences, but as partisanship becomes more important for people, as a result of their capacity to connect their own political views to other, or party identification to other things, that I think has sharpened the, and then, there's some key historical turning points. The election of Ronald Reagan was in 1980, and the Reagan presidency was one, kind of the first big moving event. The 1994 contract with America that Newt Gingrich pioneered. He got all the Republican candidates for the House to sign on to a very aggressive set of policy positions, and increasingly Republicans in Congress, beginning with Gingrich's speakership, beginning to use the tools of Congress aggressively to try to get their way. And it took the Democrats a while to kind of begin to play hardball tactics, but increasingly we're seeing that as well. And all of those things combined have, I think, created the conditions for people to feel like those who are not with us, really are the enemy. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that there's also a powerful regional component to this. So you have many states now that are very one-sidedly Republican, mostly rural, or more rural states. And then you have cities that have become overwhelmingly Democratic in many parts of the country, so that people are living in enclaves where they're hearing the same kinds of messages over and over again from their neighbors, from people in their immediate environment. So when you put all of that together, and then you throw up the rise of social media as a kind of facilitating factor, where it becomes easier for people to connect with other people with similar views, and perhaps to some degree, the rise of polarized media, MSNBC, Fox, has made it easier for people to hear only the news of people like them and filter their thinking that way. So I think when you put all this together, it's a bunch of smaller things that have kind of contributed to this environment. And then, of course, Trump comes along in 2016, and I think sharpens this even further. No politician in, I think it's safe to say, since FDR has evoked the kinds of strong feelings about him and what he stands for as Trump has. And it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have Trump voters who feel extraordinarily loyal to their guy. And you, on the other hand, have Democrats who feel like if Trump is reelected, the republic will fall. And there may be some reasons to think that. But when you put all these things together, it's a bunch of small things kind of adding up to a bigger picture.
Yeah, that was awesome. That it's a lot of factors. I did want to underscore, because I can't with my students, they were not born yet in the 90s. But Newt Gingrich did a huge amount of damage. I mean, it's profound. He really, one of the many things he did in Congress was to tell his party, tell the Republican Congress people, for example, not to move their families to DC. That used to be really, I know it sounds minor, but it really is huge. It used to be in the old days before Gingrich, many congressmen, senators would move their families to DC, which meant that Republicans and Democrats, kids were playing soccer together and they were going to school together. There was a lot more socializing. Gingrich told his party, stay home, do not move out of your districts. And critically, he asked them to change their discourse. The Democrats are not just people who we disagree with, they are un-American. I mean, that kind of rhetoric that you're seeing now, that the parties fling against each other about who's American, who's loyal, who's not to the country, to the Constitution. That's a real 90s Gingrich generation there. So there's a terrific book on this. It's by Julian Zalazar. He's a professor at Princeton, and it's called Burning Down the House. And it's about the kind of damage that Gingrich did that we live with today. I mean, one of the, it's hard to find positive things in the current environment, but the polarization, it did start at the top. It was Congress, and we're taking a lot of cues from them. It means that it could change. If they changed, we might change back. We might become less polarized if they would become. And Biden, he's a kind of bipartisan guy in his DNA. He works at it, but it's not going incredibly well.
Yeah, I've thought for a long time that there would be a real opening for some moderates in both parties to kind of create a new centrist, coalition. And there have been attempts to do this, but the parties are strong enough, especially the Republican Party in the post-Gingrich era, but increasingly the Democrats, although Joe Manchin is allowed to be, an oddball case, they have no choice because they need him to caucus in order to maintain control of the Senate. But for the most part, parties are able to discipline their members much more so than they have in the past. And so we have seen a growing number of cases, really, beginning in 2010 of, Tea Party candidates pushing aside established Republicans, later some Trump-endorsed candidates pushing aside established incumbents, or at least mounting challenges that make politicians nervous. I mean, this is their career. They want to be reelected forever. It's a great job if you have it. But if you face threats from challengers, so people, I think, particularly members of Congress have become more reluctant to not follow the lead of their parties, which makes creating some kind of alternative division in Congress where there's a wider range of views and possibilities for bipartisanship have really shrunk. And it's hard to see a way out right now. I think a lot will hinge on what happens after Trump leaves the scene. And we should probably, we can talk about that. But the current situation, I think, is one where we're kind of locked into this polarized environment. Now, I will say one thing that I do view as a positive, which is turnout in American elections has gone way up. The last three cycles since Trump was elected, 2018, 2020, the presidential year of 2020, and the midterms in 2018 and 2022, have seen the highest turnout since the early 60s, and in some measures since the before 1920. So that, I think, has getting more people involved in politics, caring about thinking. So even if they, it requires some degree of stigmatizing the enemy, so to speak, it also has increased people's desire to influence outcomes. And arguably that may carry over into a post-Trump environment. That remains to be seen. But I would expect the turnout to be extremely high. And I don't know right now, it's impossible to predict who has the turnout advantage. I think both parties have things going for them. Trump will pull many people who wouldn't otherwise vote into the ballot box. And I think Trump, on the other side, opposition to Trump, will pull many people who might not otherwise vote into, and so there's more or less, I think, standoff, but it is interesting for people who, we remember back into the 70s and 80s, turnout in presidential elections would rarely, reach 50%, even half of the eligible public, and that has shifted at least two-thirds of the eligible voters probably will participate in the 2024 election. And those are rates of participation that are not that different than in Europe. So for the first time in a long time, American political life has been energized by this polarization.
Yeah, and that's it's a good thing, I think. But I believe that we'll have a crazy record turnout in fall of 24. I mean, that's one of the few things I'm willing to predict. So Jeff, Biden he's getting a lot done. History will judge whether he's a truly great president or an okay president, but he's got a lot done that a lot of people like, and a lot of bipartisan legislation. Why is he seems like he's underperforming politically, even though kind of legislatively and with regard to foreign policy, he's had a lot of successes, but the polls are showing him and Trump super tight, even though Trump is under all these indictments. And I mean, it's this crazy conundrum that keeps coming up, and I don't have an answer to it.
Yeah, this is a really tough one to analyze using the kinds of tools that we have used in the past. So right now, the American economy is quite healthy by most measures, even though its health is unevenly distributed, and there certainly are many families that are struggling across the country. But overall, in the big macro sense, the post-COVID recovery has been quite remarkable. And ordinarily, an incumbent president would be the beneficiary of a healthy economy. Similarly, as you mentioned, Biden has really, I point to three major pieces of legislation, two of which required some bipartisanship. The third, the Democrats rammed through. The COVID relief package that was, I think, in the $2.2 billion range, which included a whole slew of policies, including policies to radically reduce child poverty, and in fact, successfully pushed the child poverty rate, the rate of children living in poor households, down to almost 5%, which is by far the lowest it's ever been. And, to the extent to which we care about children living in poverty, this is really a major achievement of that legislation. The so-called Anti-Inflation Act, which included strong environmental policies and money for, efforts to respond to the global climate crisis, as well as a bunch of other things that including some subsidies for coal companies to get Joe Manchin's support. But the infrastructure bill, which, Trump every week was infrastructure week during the Trump presidency, but nothing ever happened. And Biden successfully brought together a bipartisan coalition to get that done. And, it's well known America's bridges and roads are in a state of terrible disrepair. And this is, long overdue. So, and then I guess the other thing I'd say is, his foreign policy achievements are major. So, the response to the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine has remarkably reestablished NATO as a social and military force in a way that it seemed like it was on the road to, disappearing under Trump. The ability to kind of reconstruct America's image in the world to some degree in a post-Trump recovery, I think is a real achievement as well. So I don't think there are any Democrats really who should feel like the Biden presidency has not been a huge success. However, I think one of the reasons he's not doing as well as he should is not as many Democrats are giving Biden strong approval ratings. And, it should be the case that he should, at this point, I think, be a revered first-term president running for re-election, but he's not. And so, we have to look at kind of what other things are going on. So one is that I think the messaging on the right against the Biden administration is extraordinarily effective in mobilizing strong opposition to not just people who watch Fox News, but the people they talk to and the other people who talk to people who talk to people who watch Fox News. That the anti-Biden messaging is, I think, one thing I would point to. I would also point to, we could talk about fears about his age and the way he presents in public. Seems to have some Democrats nervous and wishing that he wouldn't run again, that somebody younger would step in. I think that's possibly a consideration. But really, I think, and it's not as if people haven't been thinking about this for 20 years or more, but the inability to message policy successes on the left or liberal policy successes is one of the remarkable features of this era Lane Kenworthy has a book called Social Democratic America, and he charts all of the expansions of the American welfare state since the 1970s under Republican and Democratic presidents. And you see a steady increase in support for poor families, support for health care, support for the earned income tax credit, which we often don't talk about, but the subsidy of workers who make relatively lower wages. I mean, these are major policy achievements, and there's nothing parallel on the right except tax cutting, which, we go through waves. We cut taxes, the budget deficit gets too big, we nudge them back up. So there's tax cutting, and then I suppose the 1996 welfare reform, although even the 1996 welfare reform eliminating the aid to families with dependent children program has been replaced by a series of programs that cumulatively spend more money trying to help poor parents enter the labor force. So all in all, it's a record of America moving slowly, not overnight, but moving slowly towards social democratic Europe in terms of the kinds of things our welfare state does, still, again, leaving people out and so forth, but getting closer to the kinds of universal protections we find in Europe. And people like most of that. So most of these things individually poll quite well, but the overall image has been undermined, I think, by successful counter messaging on the right. And there doesn't seem to be an easy way to address that. People have proposed many ideas. I don't think it's the lack of Democratic politicians talking about these successes and their impact on it, but it isn't penetrating in the same way. And I think that's really a question for communication scholars that I really don't have a great answer, but I would say that that is one thing to think seriously about.
So Biden is underperforming politically, and Trump, since he came down the escalator, is overperforming. And you'd think that social scientists like me and Jeff and so many others would have a really crisp answer to the appeal of Trump. We're not quite there yet. I mean, it's complicated and it keeps moving. It's just like the environment's so fluid. But Jeff, you want to take a stab at, what he had to start and why his popularity is kind of calcified, is really solid among tens of millions of people, even with 91 counts, and across these indictments against him. So one of these guys underperforming, and Trump, I think, clearly overperforming. So what would you say are some of the big answers from social science at this point about, what explains his grip?
Yeah, I think that's the $64,000 question going into the 2024 election. So clearly the indictments have not shaken many of his supporters, if any. He starts with a core base of about half the Republican Party, and that base has not shifted, even though he's facing all sorts of legal issues, none of which I think will sideline him in 2024. I mean, he may be convicted, but there'll be appeals and he'll be out on appeal. And, I think so. And, the never Trump Republicans at the end of the day, in this polarized environment, would rather have almost all of them would rather have a Republican president, whoever it might be, than any Democrat. And Trump is benefiting from the fact that he is that person. And so, 90+% of Republican identifiers voted for Trump in 2020, and I expect the same thing to happen here. So he's benefiting from a polarized environment where Republicans ultimately will rally to, Trump's, will rally to Trump when faced with the alternative of voting for a Democrat in the presidential race. And then, we do have various things going on that are supplementing this. And Trump's capacity to command media attention is unprecedented. It's important. He's always in the news. He's, his breaking of taboos and norms that politicians up until now have tried, respected his ability to get away with the lie, telling lies repeatedly. And this is all unprecedented. And, I think we are struggling to kind of capture a full picture of the Trump presidency. I will say a couple things on the Trump base. So evangelical Christians, who make up about 1/5 of the population, give or take, have been extremely strong and reliable Trump supporters from the beginning, even though I don't think Trump ever sets foot in a church, has had multiple marriages and social scandals that, you would think evangelicals would not like, but in fact, he is seen as the kind of transition messenger, the person who can bring about the kinds of change that many politically oriented evangelicals want. And that has been one backbone that has remained really part of his base in a way that is perplexing, but is a big part of it. And then the other thing that I think is kind of key here have been people in rural communities or areas outside the major cities. So let's say 90 minutes or more away from a central city. Populations in those areas, especially whites in those areas, are overwhelmingly 80% or more Democrat in many parts of the country, which is why states, many states like Idaho and Wyoming and places like that are so one-sidedly Republican and very, very pro-Trump in a way that I think becomes kind of reinforcing. And, in some of these places, liberals get their tires slashed and have other, unpleasant public encounters with their neighbors and learn not to, speak up or participate in political conversations and so forth. And that rural population base has really rallied to Trump, sees Trump as a kind of savior. And I think is a big part of why, even if Biden wins the popular vote, Trump may well win in the Electoral College, picking up the votes of all of those, those states. He just needs to win a few, closely contested states. And he almost did in 2020. He became very, very close in Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia. And had he won 2 of those 3, I think I have this right, he would have been president. So, and in each case, it was just a few thousand vote difference. So, he starts with that kind of base, and he can afford to write off big parts of urban America and states that that are reliably more progressive, more liberal. But I think when we look back on the Trump era and we have some perspective, which is hard to have right at this moment, we will really need some very careful rethinking of exactly what it was that allowed a Trump-like figure to emerge. I would posit, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, Susan, but I don't think at any point in the 20th century, a politician telling the kinds of lies, telling, the kinds of background, we used to say you could never be elected president if you hadn't been in public office, like you got to be a senator, a governor, or something, that's just like there were certain norms you just couldn't break, and now he breaks them all the time, and it seems if it almost helps him, and it's so counterintuitive to everything that we know about American politics pre-Trump. So there's work to be done on this, but in the interim, we have a big election coming up, which will really tell what America's going to look like in 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, even further out. So the stakes are very high, and I think people do perceive that on both sides.
It would be, Jenny, just a few more minutes, because it would be bad for me not to ask a premier sociologist like Jeff about race. I think a lot of us thought that we elected our first Black president, and the fact that he got elected and the fact that he was there and had no scandals. So the untrump, not a single scandal, and did the job. Something was going on during the Obama years. There was anger about race. There was resentment about race. A lot of people on the left would complain that Obama wasn't making big speeches all the time about race. And I mean, I think he would say, I don't know if he's spoken to this particularly, but, he's kind of running the country. And, as leader of the free world, it was not his job to try to solve racism in America. So that was, too heavy a burden, I think, on any Black president, certainly the first one. But I think that I don't know if the data will back me up on this after a few years, when we really can get some distance from this and understand it. But there is definitely, our continuing struggle, conversation about race is not settled. And Trump unleashed a kind of a conversation, resentment about race that I think it's so big and important in his rise that it's hard for us to measure. I mean, this happens in social science. Sometimes something is so big, for example, social media, that it's really hard to measure its effects because we're just swimming in it, and you can't grab it with regard to measurement.
Yeah. Well, I think the question of race and immigration, which are kind of connected together, is also an important part of the Trump story. I mean, I think Americans were polarizing on race questions prior to Obama. And really, all the way back to the civil rights legislation of the 1960s, which really was key to the end of the Southern Democrats and the rise of the current environment in which liberals are Democrats and conservatives are Republicans. Couple things to say about this. Michael Tesler, the political scientist, UC Irvine, I believe, has written a very nice book on just how Obama's presidency did kind of accelerate trends that were already underway. And so, if you go back to, he has a number of really nice graphs where he shows earlier racial controversies. You could find whites in both parties supporting the liberal position, and whites in both parties, kind of on both sides. And by the Obama years, the kinds of racial conflicts, Black Lives Matter, police shootings of unarmed Black men, so forth, that these kinds of things now, it's almost like whites who are Democrats live in one world and perceive the situation one way, and whites who are in the Republican Party see it completely differently. And Trump has unquestionably accelerated that, certainly accelerated concerns about immigration, which, I think sociologists would say basically immigration has been great for America. We don't have enough, the future of America will require more workers coming here from foreign countries for the economy to continue to thrive. We're not producing as many children per household as we used to. And that immigrants rarely commit crimes, contrary to everything Trump says. They are very hardworking. They are only eligible for a very limited range of social programs until they gain citizenship. America has benefited immensely from immigration, and the kinds of people who leave their country to move to another country tend to be people who have a lot of grit, a lot of determination. Most people just suck it up, stay where they are, not try to have a better life for themselves and their children. this idea has completely been talked about in the discussion about immigration. And for Trump has kind of reframed it as a question of American nationalism, that we have to maintain our borders and we have to, the whole premise of Make America Great Again. I don't know what year Trump thought was a great year, but best guess would be probably in the 50s when America was much whiter, before the immigration reform of 1965, which really helped spur the current wave of immigration that we've seen in the last 35, 40 years, that Trump has succeeded in politicizing immigration. And Democrats and liberals have struggled to come up with counter messaging. And so what's interesting as a sociologist is how little social science has informed these debates. Like, for example, do immigrants displace American workers? I mean, there may be some situations, probably more likely in highly educated arenas, where many foreign immigrants, are highly educated and are staffing Silicon Valley and other high-tech sectors, because Americans are not enough Americans are getting high-level training in mathematics and engineering of the sort that many immigrants in other countries are, or they come here to get it in America's colleges and universities. But the kinds of jobs that immigrants tend to take tend not to be jobs Americans want. So the entire agricultural sector would collapse overnight if we really pushed out all of the immigrant workers, because there are very few Americans at this point in time who really want a job that pays minimum wage and backbreaking labor, 10, 12 hours a day. We just don't find, people wanting to do those jobs. And so, I think a lot of corporations have become much more receptive to the message that, we need immigration. It's an important part of the American economy, but the cultural dominance of this kind of nationalist backlash that Trump has sponsored is very powerful. And the last thing I'll say about race is that Trump has made it okay to talk openly, express racist views openly in a way that I think had been suppressed by both the left and the right in American politics for a long period of time. So that, the kinds of George Bush Republicans and so forth, that era of Republicans who, supported civil rights, supported the idea of a racially egalitarian America where everybody would have equal opportunity, have disappeared. And the messaging that's coming from the right has also then attacked. So efforts like all this big talk about wokeness and so forth, there are incidents here and there that are, not great for the left if you believe in free speech and so forth. But overall, most of this is the way the right has kind of reframed the debate around race and pushed back against some of the classical kinds of the compromise that held for about 35 years after the civil rights legislation of the 1960s.
Excellent, terrific. Jen, you want to take over?
Yeah, so we've got some great questions, and we'll just march through them. First one is, did the leaders identify the polarized MAGAs, or did this population arise spontaneously?
This is a really interesting aspect of the Trump movement. It isn't organized in the way that social movements normally are organized. Other than donating to Trump's presidential campaign, there are very few active organizations that have grown up and have some independent activity apart from the Trump presidential bid, and then some of the people he supported around the country. It's very much an electoral movement, that is a movement of citizens using the ballot box to express their political views. Now, January 6th suggests, that it goes beyond just that there are people, willing to go into the streets, go into the Capitol, try to get their way. But the only really organized presence were these white supremacist groups that that did some minimal organizing. But really, it's surprising to me that we haven't seen more of a groundswell of movement activity on the right that would reflect the extraordinary realignment that Trump is promoting at the national level. I don't know what you think,
Yeah,
Susan.
I mean, absolutely. Well, Jeff, you know more about social movements than I do, but it is not, for how massive it's become and how incredibly popular Trump is. It's not a social movement from the bottom up. I mean, it all happened within our electoral system of two parties. I mean, it's really odd that way relative to other kinds of social movements that are organic and cross all kinds of lines and kind of blow up, the system as it is. This all happened kind of within our system, which, now that we can look back on it with some hindsight, we can start to see the foreshadowing and how this happened. But it's strange that way. I'm always struck when Trump talks about this movement, and he makes it sound as though it's, I don't know, it's like some rump movement that got really big, when it's really just it's just us and the structure that we had. So
yeah, he led it, he created it, he has driven it, and it's if Trump, the question to ask is, so what would happen if Trump disappeared tomorrow? Would this still be a force? And I think the longer it goes on, the more Republican officials have been elected with the Trump platform, the more likely that younger people coming into politics will, try to maintain some of this, momentum. But really, the mass base, I think, will disappear once Trump is off the stage. And it's not
right.
It's not uncommon for populist movements to be centered on a single. They're almost always men, a strong man, and the strong man, dominates political life can be decades in cases in Latin America and so forth. But when they disappear, it's often a time where the political system has to reinvent itself in some fashion. And I think that's what we're seeing here, even though Trump hasn't controlled American politics this entire era from the White House, but he has, I think, dominated the civil society in terms of where the country is going.
No, we've not. It's unprecedented, our situation right now in so many ways. But Jeff and I are both students of political history, and there's been nothing like it. Huey Long, great populist coming from the left in the early 1930s. He had, I mean, it's much more kind of organic and classically populist than Trump, and he had tremendous traction. FDR was petrified of, Huey Long on his left and then Father Coughlin on his right. And Huey Long was assassinated in the early 30s. And I don't doubt that Franklin and Eleanor breathed a huge sigh of relief, because that was some crazy, attractive grassroots movement, a lot about income redistribution, every man a king. Everybody should have a car, a radio, a guaranteed annual income. It was very attractive, especially during the Depression.
No, it's interesting. I would say, however, that those examples in the 30s were also very much groundswell movements that had, share our wealth society groups were sprouting up all over America.
Hundreds.
You could join a local group that was sympathetic to the long, proposal to share our wealth, give every household $5,000, something like that. The Townsend movement. This is a movement of old age, demanding old age pensions for everyone over 60. I think that movement had tremendous popular support. Clubs, Townsend clubs, as they were known, all over America. Millions of people at one point in time were said to be members of these clubs. So those kinds of populist movements in a different era, I think, really did have a mass base that had an organizational presence, whereas this doesn't. in any way that we can kind of conceptualize it. It's really a different phenomenon. It's related in the sense that, like Huey Long, there's many ways in which Trump delights in attacking both parties, the traditions of American politics, drain the swamp, kill the deep state, and so forth. Long had a lot of that sort of
Wall Street, yeah, evil
rhetoric. Wall Street, right? Wall Street was a big target for Huey Long. So there are certainly similarities in their political styles, but in terms of the kinds of organizational capacities that they had behind them, I think there is a big difference.
So here's a kind of different question. Do the two parties really stand for different things outside of each pandering to different sets of social issues? They seem to be pretty much in lockstep as far as taking corporate contributions, protecting Wall Street, constantly increasing the military budget, constant public praise of police and military, crushing third-party efforts, continuing mass incarceration, supporting regime change wars and dictatorial regimes abroad, etc.
That's a good way. Yeah, interesting way of looking at it. I don't know, Jeff, you take the first shot.
Well, that would be the list of things that, you could identify, productively to say that, there is still a lot of persistence of foreign policies, domestic policies that persist. But I would say, and I will, strongly say this, that, most Democrats are not in favor of supporting dictators around the world. Most Democrats today do not favor mass incarceration, would like to find better ways to, better criminal justice policies that would be racially neutral. And most Democratic politicians do not support the kind of tax cutting, both for corporations and the richest households, that Republicans support. The progressive left, the Sanders left of the Democratic Party, really largely, I think, would control the policy agenda of the party if it had a little more support, that a little more more votes at Congress, more, and I think I will say this, Biden is so much more progressive in 2023 than he was in 1992 or in 1972 when he was first elected to Congress as a centrist, Democratic senator. He is vastly more, he's been pushed to the left by the drift of the Democratic Party over the past, couple of decades. And I think the younger Democrats in Congress are far more progressive than their older generation, the Clintons, the Bidens, and even Obama, can be seen as not really a part of this kind of emerging progressive. In many ways, I think the Obama presidency is viewed by many Democratic progressives today as a very disappointing presidency that didn't challenge a lot of the kinds of policies and programs that you're talking about. So I agree with the question that there remains a lot of institutional momentum for the perpetuation of policies that have long been supported by, moderate conservative Democrats. But I think that's eroding very rapidly. And I would also say the shift to the right of the Republican Party, both in terms of certain kinds of policies, tax policy, the welfare state generally, the desire, the consensus among current, Republican strategists, not just in the Trump camp, but in the DeSantis camp, and I think several other of the kind of leading contenders in the party, is to use executive authority to fire upon gaining office, to use executive authority to just fire the entire middle layer of the federal bureaucracy. There is a thought that they could fire as many as 50,000 high-level civil servants and just clean out the deep state. The Democrats says nothing like that. Like, this is the complete opposite of, and then the last thing I'll just say is, like, the turn of Republicans against science and in favor of, dubious claims, conspiracies, lying, this is all, again, I think, not shared among Democrats and marks a real difference between the two parties.
And yeah, I agree 100% with Jeff. Also, there are some strange and interesting shifting of positions. For example, there's a really good article in The Atlantic that just came out. It's a long story about General Milley, because he's retiring soon. And a lot of this is about how difficult it was for military leaders and four-star generals to get along with Trump. And I think a lot of people on this call have probably looked at that. Apparently, it's okay now in the Republican Party and at the top with Trump to really assault the military. I mean, with Trump, it started with, the John McCain. I like people who didn't get captured. I mean, and then it was just downhill from there. But that's an odd one where you see Democrats really kind of stepping up to support the military and, strong foreign policy and America's place in the world, leadership in the world, Ukraine being a great example. And the Republicans really starting to falter on this. And it had always been their, so long had been their issue. So there's some weird shifting around too with major sectors of public policy.
Here's another question. How's the Freedom Caucus able to take the House hostage? Why can't Democrats join with moderate Republicans to pass appropriation bills, for example?
They may. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, I think they have no choice. At some point here, we're going to have, Kevin McCarthy's going to have to allow a bipartisan, clean, spending bill to go through that is supported by Democrats and a few, enough Republicans to get over the finish line. Which is how this issue was resolved when the Republicans controlled Congress in the Obama years. I mean, the bigger question is, how is it that the Freedom Caucus tail is wagging the, Republican House dog? And we're really talking about a handful of maybe 25 to 30 really kind of committed members in a caucus of 222 House Republicans shouldn't be able to exert this kind of influence. But the party has changed its rules, partly in response to their internal rules, and partly in response to demands of the Freedom Caucus to compromise and let Kevin McCarthy be elected speaker, which enable them to do all kinds of maneuvering to kind of, delay, keep, as long as the Republican Party continues to insist on, unanimous, voting, so that, nobody should be deviating from whatever we collectively decide. And the compromise has to be with this group of recalcitrant Freedom Caucusers. Kevin McCarthy, I feel badly for him. I don't share his politics, but I do sometimes think, he's got the toughest job in America, trying to wrangle, his caucus into because they remain committed to the idea that no Republican shall stray, and when Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney strayed on the, they were, rousted from Congress, and I think there's just a real reluctance to cross that line. But I think eventually it's got to happen, and it will happen because the senior leadership in the House will come together and say, we got to get this done. We can't hold up America's, credit in the world to bankrupt the country to make a point about, the budget. And we're always talking about things that have money that's already been spent. Yeah. So, the entire debate about extending the debt ceiling is really just to cover obligations that we've already incurred. Right. And it's always important to remind everybody, of that. So I do think it's interesting, the Progressive Caucus, the counter, the kind of left-wing Democrats, exert virtually very little. I mean, they do, I think, have in the bigger picture have shifted the party in important progressive ways. But, when it comes to specific legislation, they're not getting their way. Bernie Sanders wanted a $6.5 trillion COVID bailout. We got 2.2 trillion. I think I said billion earlier, which I apologize for. It's much bigger than that. We don't, we really do have this asymmetry where a small group of House Republicans are able to control, the policy positions of the party as a whole.
I mean, maybe Kevin McCarthy has more IQ points than John Boehner, who was done in by this rump faction, small group. Paul Ryan also couldn't, left in disgust. Nancy Pelosi on the other side of the aisle, you got to hand it to her. I mean, an unbelievably effective politician, because you remember the left was really kicking up a lot of dust. And she kind of domesticated them, or got them into the fold, and it's artful. And most.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, those Democratic, the Progressive Caucus is willing to compromise to get half a loaf, and the Freedom Caucusers are not willing to compromise to get anything less than a full cake. And as a result, you do have a different dynamic in Congress in the two parties. I mean, I do think Nancy Pelosi deserves a lot of when histories of this period are written, she will emerge as really the critical figure. We would not have had the Obama healthcare measure without Nancy Pelosi's brilliant maneuvering to get the votes that were needed. She has, I think, her retirement is an important. We'll see how this plays out in the immediate future. She did say she's going to run for re-election as a backbencher, which is very unusual. So she'll still be around advising, presumably, the Democratic leadership in the House. But it's a very different environment. And I think the only thing that's going to keep Kevin McCarthy afloat is the fact that there's no credible alternative. Yeah. That the Freedom Caucusers' preferred speaker could not command a majority of Republican votes. And, they want the Democrats to vote to kick McCarthy out of the speakership. But the Democrats, they quite rightly have said, no, you guys, you control Congress, you decide, let them fight amongst themselves. But every once in a while, I do think to myself, poor Kevin, I don't have that much sympathy for it, but the job is really, really bad. I don't know if it's as bad as being a university president. Susan, you would know this, having served as the president.
It's harder. His job, harder.
It is harder. Okay, being university president is also a tough one, but a lot of constituent demands. But
that's right.
So I think the debt ceiling thing, is the central issue of the moment, and we're about to go through it yet again. And this time, the Freedom Caucusers say, we're dug in. We're not going to compromise this time like we did last time. We'll see.
We'll see about that.
Jeff, this question specifically for you, or was asked of you. What are your thoughts on why there is a surge in voting participation, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it goes back, and this is one little additional data point in the response to the question about aren't the Democrats and Republicans all the same? I mean, I think there is a growing perception that it matters who wins these elections. That has filtered down throughout the electorate, and I think in particular, the existence of Trump in the center of the political system has spurred both his supporters, some of whom would not vote, and has also spurred really intense feelings among liberals and Democrats who no longer feel it's okay not to vote. We can, whatever the outcome is not really going to matter. And we have a painting by a local artist hanging in Connecticut, hanging in our house that has a picture of a woman with her hand over her head saying it's all my fault, as the background shows Trump wins the election. I should have voted. I think that kind of thing is accurately captures the kind of sentiment. I think a good question is, is this going to persist into the future in a post-Trump world? Will the intensity and care about who wins elections decline? And we'll go back to kind of where we were circa, 1990, or, is it actually people have gotten more used to voting and are more likely to keep voting and expand the electorate.
I mean, it is Trump. This is one of the many things political scientists did not expect, is that Trump would actually bring out people, white people in particular, who had not voted before or voted very sporadically. I mean, we didn't realize that was possible. We're so focused on the growing Latino population and how that was possibly problematic for the Republicans. But yeah, Trump expanded the Republican electorate for himself in ways that are impressive.
All right, here's a different sort of path to go down. In my own life, I found having conversations across the political divide impossible. Do you have any constructive advice for interacting with the opposite faction, or is that now a thing of the past?
It's funny, I just asked this question to one of my colleagues, she's at Princeton, Frances Lee, who is from the Deep South. And I asked her, so how's it going with her family? And she's like, this is really, and she's an expert on polarization and, understands all these issues. And it's just, even for somebody like her, she's a really nice person, but she's so adept in these issues and loves her family, it's really hard to bridge these divides. I don't know. I do think that there's common ground, and that people can still talk to each other. It's just that we have to start on the outer ring with the issues that are more likely to get consensus, and then work our way to the harder ones. So when I have tried to talk to people that I deeply disagree with, I try to start with issues that we might share in common. For example, I mean, I do think as little as most people are interested in foreign policy, Ukraine is not a bad place to start having conversation with people, because it is about, can one country just march into another country and take over and take their stuff and take their property? Is that something that we should allow in this world, that national sovereignty is that weak and that impermeable, and that should we, so I think there are areas like that you can start with and then work your way to some of the harder stuff like race, which is possibly that's the third rail of American politics. And so I don't know, Jeff, what do you think?
Well, I think you're raising one really good point here, which is that it's easier to talk about specific issues, albeit, there's certain things that you can't have conversations with people who are, abortion, same-sex marriage, a few other things. But something like the war in Ukraine is an example, but there are also many others where, you can have the conversation. But when it's about Trump, it becomes much more difficult to have, for those who oppose Trump and those who strongly support him, often living under the same roof or in the same family or in the same, workplace setting. It's really tough. And
you can't start with Trump. Like, in these conversations that I've had with people, if you start out with him, and, if I say, look, he's lied about this and that, and he tries to destroy the Justice Department, the CIA, I mean, that's going nowhere, because then it just gets people upset. But I think it's got to be issue based, and then you can get to the harder stuff. I'm not like claiming success in any of this, but theoretically.
Jeff, this might come from one of your students. None of the major issues, this is a comment, none of the major issues young voters care about are being solved. They think this government is completely ineffective. They know about all the defects that are ruining government today. The old white legislators are not working for future generations. They're failing.
Yeah. Well, I do think a lot of those old white guys are slowly being displaced by a new generation of younger politicians who are much more attuned to kind of the, immediate future. The climate crisis is kind of forcing its way onto the political agenda, not because of any particular change in the advocacy around global warming and other related climate issues. It's just the reality of, this summer when the temperatures across the world were exactly 1.5 degrees Celsius above normal, and we saw catastrophes everywhere. And, the projections are that, by 2060, 1.5 degrees above Celsius would be the low end of what we're likely to experience. So this past summer may be an example of the best we can hope for in the future. And the worst could be dramatically, much, much worse. And, I do think that this is a generational, it's an issue for all of us, but it is certainly felt much more deeply by those who will be, alive in 40, 50 years. I mean, Susan and I may be still around, hopefully, but younger people will, be, and so I do think, particularly among Democrats, around the country, where a new generation is rising. They're much less white. They're much more female. They're much more people of color getting elected to office who, are really willing to, challenge the old. So I know saying patience is not an easy answer to give, but I do think at least on the left or among, on the liberal left, we are going to see change. It's coming, but right now it's trapped by this current divide that we're in, and remains a bitterly divided 50-50 country nationally, and neither party has established majority control. I would say also, I would point to one thing, if I had to give some optimistic example, I would point to California, where the political system, I grew up in California, the political system of the 60s, 70s, and 80s fostered, this was the home of the John Birch Society, this was the home of Reagan, Nixon, Pete Wilson, anti-immigrant policy, and so forth. But eventually a kind of combination of population shift and ideological realignment, you now have a very different California. And in spite of the efforts to stigmatize California for its problems, it remains, the single most remarkable economic engine of America. It is at the center of a global economy that, remains robust. The fact that housing prices are so high in California reflects two things. On the one hand, a miserable situation for young people trying to buy a house. On the other hand, it reflects the robustness of the economy, and there are people with the money to buy these houses, which is why, prices are as high as they are. And at the same time, the state of California has adopted some of the most progressive policies on the environment, on criminal justice issues, on race, gender, inclusion, just across the board. There are a lot of, I think, if you want to see a possible future for America that might make you feel good, I would say we could look to California. And it's not that everything is going extremely well, but I think it is an example of how things can change even within a two-party system.
I just add to that really quickly. Everybody hears such bad news about higher education and wokeness and, it's kind of critique of what's going on in our universities and colleges. I will tell you, the students that I have now, this generation of students who are in college right now are terrific. They're very outward focused. Do not be fooled by all the devices and looking at phones and everything. They're very outward. They're very tolerant. They do care deeply about the environment. This is a generation of students who grew up being told that bullying and racism are wrong, and that's deep in their psyche. They also have been brought up knowing that they should do some social service. So many middle schools and high schools require social service now that when they get to college, they say, like, shouldn't I, in addition to my studies, be trying to help some people in this community? So I'm incredibly hopeful. They just got to get older faster so they can take over political positions and run for office.
Yeah. I mean, I think, in a two-party system, big change comes relatively slowly. But we have two big examples in the 20th century the New Deal, and the Reagan era, both of which represented, whether or not we want to call them realignments. You political scientists, Susan, don't like that term anymore, but certainly represented a real sea change in the policy political environments of those two eras. And, I like to be optimistic. I like to tell my students, yes, things might appear bleak, but under the surface, a lot is going on, and there's certainly opportunities to bring about change. And, we can expect it. The world of 2040 will not look like the world of 2023. And what form it takes, I think, remains open, but we know it will be different, and how it will be different is very much in the hands of, of our younger generation.
That's optimistic and a good opportunity to close, but I do want to ask one more question that's popped up that I think is interesting. And Susan, this may really fall to you. Are the congressmen responding to their leaders or more to their constituents?
It's still both. It's hard to, those are complicated jobs to be a congressperson. You do have to follow leadership, you have to go with your caucus, but you do have to do constituent service. And they know that. I mean, if you talk to your local congressperson, or, over a drink or beer, they will tell you that they're away from their families. They spend a huge amount of time in Washington. During the day, they're in their offices or on the floor. At night, they go to the DNC or the RNC or some office somewhere, and they just sit there all night and call for money, call donors or potential donors for money, and get out to the district and try to, still try to help people get visas and get into West Point and get their social service checks, whatever. So they'll always be, they're always doing fundraising and constituent service. So they have to stay elected. They tend to have a pretty good ear to the ground. That said, they do have to toe the party line. The national politics matter. People are watching national politics. And so local congressperson, as much as they'd like to serve their district, have got to also teach their district what's going on nationally with the parties. So I think it's a kind of, I don't think you can dichotomize it that much. They'll always have to do both. They'll always have to be with their caucus, be with the elites, and they will always have to do constituent service to stay in office. The case I'm watching is Lauren Boebert. That's my current favorite congressional race, to see how she gets past her current problem, and can she do enough constituent service that, because those are the people that are going to keep her in the, Kevin McCarthy can't keep her in there. It's got to be her own people in Colorado that vote her in come the next fall.
So what do you think? Will a third party ever win in American politics?
Yeah, I think it will never happen, or at least it would require an extraordinary situation like the run-up to the Civil War, where the Republican Party emerged as a third party and eventually became one of the two parties in the system. There's so many ways in which it is very, very difficult for a third party to gain traction. The lack, in Europe, you have many countries have proportional representation, so a party can win 10% of the national vote and get 10% of the seats in the national legislature, or they have established multi-parties that can compete for votes in different parts of their country and win seats. I mean, here, the first past, we call the first past the post rule, where you have to win a plurality of votes to get any representation, makes it extremely difficult for third parties to get traction. And the evidence for this is that we have had literally hundreds of efforts, in at least a dozen or more very serious ones, led by former presidents or vice presidents, from Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign to others, and I think what happens to these third parties that are centered on a famous individual or prominent, like the Ross Perot's effort to kind of create a third party, it's very hard to sustain, and all of the incentives flow to play ball in the major, play ball inside one of the two parties. And I think that's even more true now because, what ideological position is not represented in one of the two major parties? I mean, if you're a young socialist, there are members of Congress who share your views. There are elections around the country where socialists are competitive in Democratic primaries. If you're a far right, white supremacist, there are Republicans who believe what you believe. There's a place for you. So I think the space of each of the two parties has grown over the past 40, 50 years. And I don't know. Cornel West is mounting a third-party effort. Cornell, is a wonderful speaker, very charismatic, and may actually, take votes away from Biden in ways that could potentially do a replay of 2000, where Ralph Nader took enough votes away from Al Gore in Florida and other states to throw the election to Bush. I don't know if that'll happen. I don't know if Cornell will really stay in the race. If I see him, I'll certainly urge him to get out. But the kinds of challenges he's making are very much shadows of previous third, party efforts. There's always things to be dissatisfied about, but the capacity to achieve, political change from within one of the two major parties, I think, has grown over time.
Well, Susan and Jeff, thank you for your time and for sharing your wisdom. I hope you'll return to revisit this topic, I don't know, perhaps in November 2024.
Happy to.
We'll probably have something to talk about.
Probably.
For sure.
Yeah. Our next NFRPP program will be on Thursday, October 19th at 7:30 p.m. Susan Herman, the inaugural Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law, will be joined by Elisa Massimino, Visiting Professor of Law and Executive Director of Georgetown's Human Rights Institute, to answer the question, what are human rights anyway? That program will be guest hosted by Samita Nadia Hussain, co-founder of the Bangladeshi American Women's Development Institute. We hope you will join us. Watch your email for a brief survey on tonight's program. We do use your input to shape future programs. Thank you all, and we'll see you on October 19th. Good night. Jeff and Susan, thank you so much.
Thank you.